The frightening true story of the Crossbow Cannibal seems entirely fictional. Through 2009 and 2010, Stephen Griffiths brutalized 3 women in West Yorkshire, England. After murdering each one with his crossbow, he dismembered them and even consumed parts of them before dumping their remains in a nearby river. Fortunately, due to his ignorance and desperation, he was captured on camera as he murdered his last victim. This is the chilling origin story and case of the Crossbow Cannibal. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. I'm super excited and appreciative that you've chosen to spend a little time listening to something that, if we're being honest, isn't the easiest thing to do. Before 10-Minute Murder was a thing, I used to do fun things, like have dreams without people chasing me trying to kill me and eat me. I used to spend more time looking up ordinary weird things on the internet that did not involve violence. For instance, have you ever seen John Stamos' belly button? It's not quite right. Of course, you know rule number 3 of 10-Minute Murder is we don't kink shame. But did you know that rule number 4 is that we don't body shame? And that's not what I'm doing here, to be clear. I'm simply pointing out that John Stamos has a belly button that looks like an alien is trying to escape from inside his large intestine. It's also a little bit too high. Kelly Ripa has one that's pretty similar too. See, this is the kind of information that I thought about and I looked up before 10-Minute Murder took up the idle space in my brain. But now that it does, I don't have time for stuff like that. Anyway, none of that is why you came here today. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing. It's totally free. Connect on social media and stay up to date with what's happening and see visuals to the stories that you hear me talking about. And the place to go for all things 10-Minute Murder related, 10minutemurder.com. Okay, now to the story that you actually came to hear. On December 24th, 1969, in Yorkshire, England, Stephen Griffiths was born to his father, who was a frozen food salesman, and his mother, a telephonist. When Stephen was 13 years old, his parents divorced, and he primarily lived with his mother. She was reported as being a con artist, who was later convicted of fraud after Stephen was out of her care. Stephen describes these years with his mother as being unstable due to his mother bringing different men in and out of the home. He also confessed that he had a strange and disgusting habit of watching his mother have sex with these different men in their backyard. During his teen years, Stephen dabbled in petty crimes. He'd often shoplift and he'd pickpocket classmates in school. However, his worst crime up to this point was when he was 17. He used a knife to slash the face of a store clerk when they tried to stop him from shoplifting. After this, Stephen was sentenced to 3 years in juvenile custody. While he was in prison, he began fantasizing about becoming a serial killer. On many occasions, he'd openly discussed this with the prison guards and his psychiatrists. Despite his brutal honesty, though, after his sentence was completed, they released him back into the wild with little to no supervision. His crimes, not surprisingly, did not end. In 1989, Stephen received 100 hours of community service after being caught carrying a pistol, which he confessed to using to kill birds and dissect them. In 1991, his psychiatrist diagnosed him with schizoid personality disorder, which is a lack of interest in social relationships and the tendency to shelter yourself and be emotionally cold. And just a year later, he threatened a knife on the throat of a young girl and was sentenced to just 2 years in prison, despite his history of crimes. After being released, Stephen dove headfirst into his interest in serial killers. His favorite book at the time was about Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, the man who was convicted of murdering 13 women in the late 1970s. Despite his criminalistic and bizarre behavior, Stephen held a 2-year relationship with a woman from 1998 to 2000. She reported that he wouldn't allow her to ever enter his apartment, but when she finally did, she immediately called their relationship over. Disturbingly, every surface in his home was completely covered in plastic. Stephen's behavior only grew increasingly odd, if that's possible. In 2001, his neighbors recalled him walking around with his pet lizards on dog leashes and even taking them to nightclubs. One witness also claims to have seen Stephen eating a live baby rat during this time, though this is just speculation. Additionally, during this time, Stephen began heavily drinking and dabbling in drugs. In 2003, Stephen graduated from the University of Bradford with a bachelor's degree in psychology. After this, he enrolled in a PhD program in homicide studies. And during these years, in the early 2000s, like many of us, he became active on MySpace, where he'd post horrible messages and quotes from serial killers under the alias Ven Pariah. He'd also occasionally quote fictional killers, including family annihilators and necrophiliacs. Although he'd worked to receive several degrees, he was unemployed and spent the better half of his time downloading violent pornography onto his computer. Stephen had begun to fantasize about having victims of his own, just like the serial killers that he praised. Over the next few years, he spent most of his time roaming Bradford's red light district in the middle of the night, on the prowl for someone to release his urges onto. He specifically chose the Bradford area in a twisted way to honor Peter Sutcliffe, as he had murdered many of his victims in that exact same location. On June 22, 2009, Stephen met 43-year-old Susan Rushworth. He promised her money in exchange for sex. Once back in his apartment, Stephen fatally shot Susan with the weapon that would later define him, a crossbow, before dismembering her in his bathtub. Her remains have never been found. A little less than a year later, on April 26, 2010, 31-year-old Shelley Armitage became Stephen's next victim. She was also a sex worker. Stephen found it much easier to target sex workers, as they're often looked at as less than and never prioritized by law enforcement. And once again, Stephen shot Shelley with his crossbow. After she was dead, he used a cleaver to chop up her remains. He later confessed that he would save parts of his victims to later eat, sometimes cooking them and sometimes consuming them raw. Stephen bagged up Shelley's remains and boarded public transport to dispose of her in the river near Bradford. This crime, though, was much more horrifying than his first. As he butchered Shelley, Stephen videotaped the crime on his phone as he narrated every action. But being the incompetent killer that he was, Stephen mistakenly dropped his phone and lost it while he was on the train. It was taken and, oddly, sold before being handed to the police. In May of 2010, Stephen committed his last murder. He kidnapped 36-year-old sex worker Suzanne Blamiers. He held her hostage in his apartment for 2 days. She bravely attempted to escape on May 21st, but was chased down by Stephen in his apartment hallway and was ultimately fatally shot from his crossbow. But this murder was caught on CCTV footage. Stephen realized that he was on security camera footage just after shooting Suzanne, and he casually walked past the security camera and raised his middle finger in an act of arrogance. After this, he dragged Suzanne's lifeless body back to his apartment. He, again, dismembered her and likely saved some of her remains before dumping the rest of her in the river. Once the owners of the apartment building reviewed the CCTV footage, they were horrified, obviously. They then alerted the police, and Stephen was arrested in his apartment. The police reported that he did not attempt to avoid arrest, as he'd completed his goal of becoming a serial killer. In Leeds Crown Court, Stephen introduced himself as the Crossbow Cannibal, the alias that would later become his official nickname. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Judge Openshaw told the court, quote, "The circumstances of these murders are so wicked and monstrous, they leave me in no doubt the defendant should be kept in prison for the rest of his life." End quote. Stephen has made several suicide attempts while being in prison, and in 2019 was even attacked with a sharpened piece of wood by another inmate, but he survived. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for listening, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, if you are new to listening to 10-Minute Murder, even if you're not new, if you've been listening a while, if you have not yet subscribed to the podcast, please do that. It helps both of us, honestly. And the main thing that it helps with is whether you're binging episodes or just regularly listening. I have trouble with that word, by the way. You'll very rarely hear me say regularly because it's one of those words that I can't say very well unless I slow it down and say all the syllables. See, I can't do it. If you often listen to the podcast, If you're subscribed, you don't have to type it in to try to find it every time. It's always going to be right there, and it's always going to keep you up to date with the latest episodes. And if you're binging, it helps too, because you don't have to search for it that way either. You can just pick up right where you left off if you need to stop binging for a little while. Connect on social media if you want to follow 10 Minute Murder and know what's happening with the show, as well as see the visuals that go along with the episodes. All those links are in the show notes, or just as easily, you can type it into the search bar and it's going to pop right up. Merchandise, links to where you can listen, links to where you can follow on social media, all of that stuff is at 10minutemurder.com. Finally, if you like the show, like 5-star like the show, let me encourage you to leave that feedback wherever you're listening. If it's on Apple Podcasts, perfect. Spotify, they do it too. Audible, you can leave 5-star reviews there as well. All of that helps the show grow. And the more the show grows, the more time I can put into it. So it's a win-win situation. Thank you for listening to 10 Minute Murder. Be safe and make good choices. Regularly.